studying the Holocaust? The biggest reason is I think there's some lessons to be learned. And throughout this 9-part session, we're going to come to know what some of those lessons are, especially for me as a person of faith. How should I, as a Christian, respond to the Holocaust, the systematic persecution of 6 million Jews and at least 4 million other people, if not 5 or 6 million more people. But I first got interested in it when I was a student at Princeton. One of my professors, J. Christian Baker, in English we say Becker, but in Dutch we say Baker, had been a prisoner in one of the concentration camps because he spoke out against Hitler. He was a New Testament scholar, and as opposed to some of the professors who signed on to Hitler, saying, yes, he's the new Messiah, he's great, he's going to do wonderful things for us, God has sent him to us to work out God's will in the world, and oh yes, by the way, Jews and people who are dissidents and people who protest, they are expendable. They are not to be valued. So that tuned me in. Even though I was a young, 21-year-old at the time, I thought, what do you mean a Holocaust? What do you mean a systematic and brutal strategy to get rid of a certain group of people simply because they are Jews? Now, it is true that J. Christian Becker was Christian, and he was targeted for protesting. He was not targeted specifically for being a Christian. He was targeted because he was a Christian who protested. And Elie Wiesel, who read Night again? Who had it on their shelf? Somebody? You did.
Yeah, I started last night, read half the book.
Yeah, it's one of those books that once you start it, it's really hard to put down. You want to see what happens next. And it's probably the most poignant story by a survivor that I can think of. So if you haven't read the 148 pages or whatever it is of Elie Wiesel, that's W-I-E-S-E-L, Night, you ought to do that. But he once said, not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims. Think about that. Not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims. So Chris Becker was not targeted because he was a Christian. He was targeted because he spoke out against Hitler. So then I went to the Netherlands to be a student, and I bumped into Corrie ten Boom. We say in English Corrie ten Boom, but it's Corrie ten Boom, Corrie of the woods or Corrie of the trees. The word boom is for tree in Dutch. And then she wrote 3 books. You and I were talking about that. The Hiding Place, Tramp for the Lord, in My Father's House, is it? In My Father's House. So I had a chance to, by coincidence, meet her. We need to get another chair, perhaps. I can slide out. Oscar, you going to do that? Send me a bill. Once again, my name is Kyle Height. Pastor of First Pres.
Thank you, Jim.
And then I became acquainted with the Anne Frank House. In Dutch, the Anne Frank House. And you're going to be there in a couple weeks, so please get in there. However you don't mention my name, that will certainly deny you access. but get in there and see that and give a report to us in one of our future sessions. To be in that place where Anne Frank and 7 others lived for 2 years, and to see her bed, to see the pictures of the movie stars, because she had a real fascination with movie stars. They're still on the wall. Takes you back to that time when a young girl who's 13 is in prison for 2 years of her life. And I was saying to my friend Nancy the other night that when I looked at the diary, I read it again. After probably 20 years, I read it again. This is the unabridged definitive edition. So it's got everything in there. All of her questions about growing up as a young woman, her crush that she develops on this young man who's also living in what they call in Dutch the Achterhuis, that is the secret annex. This is the complete kind of thing. And I thought to myself, surely, if she writes so well, she's 13, 14, 15 years of age, surely they doctored this up. You know, when they translated it into English, they had someone who kind of took the language and took the language of a 13, 14, 15-year-old girl and elevated it to be something beyond what it really was. And then I read it in Dutch. Doggone it. She was an insightful, wonderful writer. And they didn't elevate it, they simply let it be what it was. And she writes beautifully. So I would heartily recommend, whether you read this before in your life, and it was even 2 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, for, how much did this cost me? Like $5? Go ahead and get a copy of Anna Frank's The Diary of a Young Jewish Woman. So all that got me interested in doing something with the Holocaust, and I always taught at small private liberal arts colleges, and my terminal degree, isn't that an interesting phrase, my terminal degree? It's kind of like you get a PhD and it's over, right? Was in Christian systematic theology. But you know, when you go to a small private liberal arts college, they'll let you teach that maybe once every 3 years if you behave yourself. I seldom behave myself. But things you have to teach are like world religions, the meaning of life, science and religion, religion and ecology. And they asked me to teach, if I was willing, Holocaust studies. And so I taught a course on religion and violence, a study of the Holocaust and other genocides. So that got me even further involved. And then I spent, the last 10 years, I've spent 4 summers at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And I'll tell you, that's also an experience you ought to have. But I'll mention this to you. If that's God, tell God I'm going to get right to the presentation after this long introduction when the orders were being undertaken by Brian. If it's my former university, tell them I'm going to pay the library fines and I'll pay the parking tickets. Quit hassling me. Quit hassling me. So I spent 4 of those summers the last 10 years at the Holocaust Museum. And I could only take in about an hour or 2 each day. It was just too much. But spacing it over 90 days and talking to survivors and the survivors of survivors, their children and grandchildren. And there's a new feature they have there that is spectacular. It's a kind of hologram. And what they've done, they've taken certain survivors and their stories, and they've all fed it into a computer. Tamara, you would just think this is wonderful. And what they've done is you can stand in front of this particular representation of a survivor and ask him or her questions. And they respond as if they're right there. Think about, I can't even imagine how you load enough information into all of that to make sure that that's going to work. But they do that. And so these persons who now almost all of whom have died. I mean, think about the Holocaust being 33 to 45, 1933 to 1945, and persons who might have been 30 or 40 years old back then, you can see they've become quite aged. But their stories and your ability to interact with them, that's not done. And so if you go to that museum, and I would heartily recommend that you do so, it will be life-changing for you. Maybe the last piece of how I got involved is, I used to take students on a regular basis, and sometimes clergy, and sometimes members of churches, lay folks, to Israel. And always when we went there, we'd go to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And there's something to be said about going through that museum in Jerusalem. And I often had Jewish students go as well, because I tried to sell the trip as being a visit to sacred sites for Christians and for Jews. I'd have some Jewish students, and one of my most memorable experiences there was looking up and seeing the Christian, I'll get emotional, the Christian students and the Jewish students walking with their arms around each other's shoulders through there, supporting each other, with the Christians being sensitive to what had happened to the forebears of those Jews, and those Jewish students feeling like, our experience, my people's experience, that's been affirmed. A powerful, powerful experience. So if you should happen to get to the Holy Land, to the country of Yisrael in Hebrew, make sure you visit Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem.
Not to interrupt, but how does the Jerusalem Holocaust Museum compare to the one in this country?
Oh, that is such an excellent question. Your check will be in the mail shortly after
From Kyle
lunch.
Hyde, I assume.
Yeah, right?
That's right. Kyle Height will have signed that. It's very similar. The quality is very high. The one most poignant aspect, I think, is it has candles that are burning in there with a bunch of mirrors. And so those lights get magnified. And so you get this sense of a never-ending spectacle of light, which only begins to help you understand what it means for 6 million people to have been exterminated. 2/3 the Jewish population of Europe. 1.5 million of them children. So it's powerful. I think I like the Washington, D.C. Museum a little bit better because the Jewish one is so riveted on the Jewish experience that sometimes you can't step back thoroughly and see there are other dynamics to it. For example, people who study the Holocaust are not just religious studies people like me. They are psychologists and sociologists. They are historians. They are Jewish scholars themselves. And so it's a bigger thing than just the Jewish experience. And the Yad Vashem in Israel accents that Jewish experience. Not totally, but very much the majority of the experience. Both are great. Go to both. I probably like the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. a little bit better. So.
Do they still give you the name of a person that you're going to follow? When we were there.
Yes, so you did that. So you can
Yeah.
speak that experience firsthand. Yes, that makes it so personal.
Yeah.
You know, if I just say to you, 6 million Jews died. It's like if I tell you an airplane crashed and 350 people's lives were lost. But if one of those persons was a relative or a friend of yours, it gives a whole new perspective on statistics, doesn't it?
You carry it around with you.
And
the
so you
whole
carry
tour.
around and you
then
follow that person's life, and unfortunately,
Find
most
out
often
again.
death, through the whole experience.
And grandchildren give them children's.
Children's names to
Names.
follow through.
Yeah.
Yeah, see, and they work it so much that it becomes a personal experience, and that's why for me, I can't take more than just a couple, 3 hours at a time. It's just too overwhelming. In this series we're doing, 9 items altogether, somebody asked me, well, you're talking about the victims in a future session, and you kind of said, Anne Frank, and other victims. Why did you do that? The reason why we're doing that is that allows it to become very personal, because you see all this through the eyes and the writing and the ears and the writing of a young woman. And it makes it very down to earth, very personal. To use a Christian term, it becomes very incarnate. It becomes very much in the flesh that persons are having this experience. And so it's not just like, well, 350 people were killed, and it's like you're thinking, oh my God, I knew somebody. Or that was a relative, or that was a friend. So you become friends with that person in a sense that you're following that person's life, and unfortunately most often their death through the experience of the Holocaust. But gee, that sounds awfully depressing. Let's shift things to be a little more uplifting, and so we're going to do that. If you look at the Holocaust experience, one of the striking aspects, it's kind of depressing as well, there's a lot of compliance. That is a lot of folks saying, we're going to go with it. For whatever reason. Selfishness, there were some economic benefits to be had. Even clergy who signed on to saying Hitler's the greatest, they got stipends for doing that. They got money for signing on to be pro-Nazi. So sometimes there was selfishness, sometimes there was greed, Some of your Jewish neighbors, if they were taken away, guess what happened? People went in and looted their apartments and looted their houses. Could this killing machine have been operated without the contribution of professors from universities who designed the killing machinery of the Holocaust? No. So there were professors that jumped in and developed things like the crematoria, Zyklon B, the gas that was used to kill people in the gas chambers. Where do you think that came from? It came from scientists. And P.S., this is why I can't take Bayer aspirin. I take St. Joseph's every day, 81 milligrams. Bayer aspirin was a part of the Bayern conglomerate, and they developed Zyklon B. So you might call me, oh, he's being eccentric, he's being overreactive. For whatever reason, I can't do it. So I buy St. Joseph's, which is $4.89 over here at Walmart. So a lot of compliance, that's my point. Not much defiance. And look at this rally. Is that going to help you if you kind of... Well, the question becomes, can I trust Methodists in the dark? I know I can't trust these Presbyterians, so I'm getting real nervous now. Look at one of these rallies at Nuremberg. I can't even estimate how many thousands of people are there. 100,000 people maybe? I don't know. So not much defiance, but look at this picture. All these folks are doing the Nazi salute, but look what I drew a circle around. That one guy there who says, I'm not doing that. I'm not following this idiot. I'm simply going to be opposed. So we're going to talk a bit about some people who stood up, who spoke out, who spoke against, who put their lives on the line to be able to help people that they didn't really know, perhaps, and people who, in a lot of cases, came from a different religion. So, the story of Anne Frank, you're going to be on the Prinsesstraat 263. You're going to be at this address, and I hope you can go ahead and get in. You told me the line the last time was all the way around the block, and da-da-da-da-da. So get there early, get in. There's a museum with it, as well as being the actual hiding place behind the bookcase. So, one of our most powerful stories is the story of Anne Frank. Anne Frank. What doesn't get told sometimes is, well, who in the world hid Anne Frank? And one of the key conspirators against the Nazis was this woman who died in 2010. Just a month before her 101st birthday. And her name is Miep Gies. Miep Gies. If you have a sore throat, it really helps in pronouncing Dutch words, right? So Miep Gies. Miep Gies. She worked for Otto Frank, that is Anne Frank's dad, since 1933, when the Frank family emigrated from Germany to Amsterdam. So originally Anne Frank was German, and she was able to hide them out in a secret series of rooms at the back of the factory where Otto Frank made a kind of substance that helps jams and jellies kind of stick together. That's what he did, and she worked for him since 1933. So then in 1942, when it became clear that the Frank family is in trouble, I mean, both Anna's elder sister, Margot, M-A-R-G-O-T, and Otto had summons in the mail to step up and kind of go in, and that didn't mean a good thing. It wasn't like, it's like when you get a note that says you got to go to the principal's office. You know, that's not going to be good. So they get these summons, and they know there's going to be a problem. So they go into hiding, and they're able to hide for 2 years. The reason why we have, and I need to move more quickly because I could talk a long time about each one of these rescuers. The reason why we have this particular diary is due to Miep Gies. When they came in August of '44 and they arrested the Frank family and the other folks who were hiding in the Achterhouse, that is the secret annex, They just simply scattered the papers of Anne's diary all across the floor, along with other things she had done. She liked to do some artwork, she liked to write poems. That was all across the floor. So when the Gestapo left, Miep Gies collected all of those papers together and hid them in one of the drawers of her desk. And throughout the war, she kept them there. She never read any of the diary because she thought that was too private, that was Anne's. So the only person who survives out of the 8 people in the Achterhaus in the secret annex is Otto Frank. He survives Auschwitz. Against all odds, he makes it. He goes back to the secret annex, and Miep gives him these papers and says, "This is Anna's legacy." 2 years later, 1947, a Dutch collection of these writings comes out, and then a few years later, it's translated into all kinds of languages and is one of the best-selling books ever. So Miep Gies puts her life on the line, hiding these Jews. The only reason she herself escaped was that she originally came from Vienna, Austria. And the guy who was the head of the Gestapo, who stopped by to arrest the Frank family and the others that were with them, he was from Vienna. And he recognized her accent because she spoke to him in German, and he let her go because of the Viennese connection. Otherwise, Miep Gies would have met a fate similar to the Frank family and the others that were hiding with them, because she hid Jews, and that was punishable by death. No questions asked. You were simply dead. You know this one because you've seen the movie, right? How many people have seen Schindler's List? Long movie. Schindler is not the kind of person I want my daughter to marry. He was a boozing, womanizing, greedy industrialist. But he saves 1,200 Polish Jews. I guess maybe there's hope for me. If you can be imperfect and good things can still happen, then there's hope for me. And Bill, I really think there's even hope for you. Anyway.
We did go to his factory museum. So.
Oh, you did see that. Well, then you know, perhaps, that the way he saved these Jews was he got work permits for them.
Yep.
And he said, "These Jews are essential to working in my factory, and my factory is contributing to the war effort," and he would take anybody to try to get them in there. And thereby he saved 1,200 Jews. And in the cemetery in Jerusalem, where he is buried, in the Jewish tradition, you don't put flowers on people's graves. You put stones across the headstone. And there are always stones across, people visiting to see Oskar Schindler's grave. Portrayed very convincingly by Liam Neeson in the movie. I think it came out mid-90s. Am I correct about that? I'm thinking it was maybe the mid-90s. I do remember that Steven Spielberg was the director and the producer. And Spielberg, of course, is Jewish, but he didn't take his Jewish heritage very seriously. As a result of this movie, he became a person saying, we've got to preserve the memory, we've got to honor those people who died, we've got to also honor those persons who survived and tell their stories. And so he started taping the stories of survivors. And he's gotten tens of thousands of interviews, and thank goodness he did, because as I mentioned to you, the survivors, just like our men who fought in the Second World War, the numbers are dying, the numbers are dwindling. So, Oskar Schindler, 1,200 Polish Jews. How about this guy? A Swede. In Budapest, he saves 100,000 Hungarian Jews. Now, how does he do this? Well, he was a Swede, and what he started doing was giving Swedish passports and documents to Jewish people in Budapest. And they could go to the Swedish embassy, and then they are off limits to the Gestapo trying to arrest them. But wait, how many people can you get in the grounds of an embassy. So what he did was he rented and started buying apartment buildings, in part funded by the Swedish government, in part funded by some American Jewish organizations. And he declared that those were also the property and the territory of the Swedish government, and so hands off of these people as well. So altogether, Raoul Wallenberg saves about 100,000 Hungarian Jews. Unfortunately, in 1945, he's arrested by the Soviets because they believe he's an American spy, and we never knew what happened to him. But because after Gorbachev, certain documents became publicly available, it appears that he died in an internment camp of a heart attack. So a tragic kind of ending, but a sacrificial action that he underwent. Two religious folks in particular I want to accent. Martin Niemöller was pastor of a church, Lutheran church in Berlin. He's the one who wrote the poem, They Came First. Remember that one? They came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I was a Christian. Here's the key line. And then they came for me, and by that time, there was no one left to speak up. So, Niemöller opposed Hitler. Actually, he was a member of the Nazi Party to start with. So a clergy person who's a member of the Nazi Party, he has second thoughts about that. He becomes opposed to Hitler and what Hitler was doing. So he spends 7 years in a concentration camp. But he did survive. He did survive, but he spent seven years. And this rascal on this side is arguably one of the premier theologians of the 20th century. Karl Barth is his name. It's not Karl Barth, like my students like to always say. Some of my students that didn't like him called him Karl Barth. So it's not Karl Barth, and it's not Karl Barth. It's Karl Barth. He was Swiss, but he was teaching in Germany. And a group of theologians who refused to sign an oath of loyalty to Hitler. Get that? A group of theologians who refused to sign an oath of loyalty to Hitler. Most did sign that oath of loyalty, by the way. But a group of them gathered together who refused to sign. And they said, we need to write a certain declaration that indicates that we are not the state church. So my students were able to experience Tina Strobos and her story. And one of the things she said that I'll never forget, one time the Gestapo, 9 times they came and raided her grandmother's house and searched it, and they couldn't find the Jews. And part of the reason was she had like a secret window in the back, and they would escape to other buildings if the Gestapo came. And she had like a secret bell that she would push to let the Jews know that the Gestapo was on the premises, right? And so then they'd flee to, anyway, 9 times. And on one of those occasions, her grandmother, who I guess was a feisty woman, approaches this one guy who's the head of the Gestapo who's there, and basically says, "Get out of here." And he goes, and she goes, "I think I saw you stealing a Persian carpet from one of my Jewish neighbors' houses last week. I think I should turn you into the authorities." And that guy goes, "Ah," and he leaves. And what Tina said was, she said, most people feared the Gestapo. everyone feared my grandmother. And then Tina died a couple years later at the age of 91. At the age of 91. So I thought you might enjoy just a regular person, a student. I like to also talk about some students too, because it wasn't just persons who were full adults who were doing things to try to save Jews and to protest Hitler. And so Hans Schul and his sister, Sophie, were students at the University of Munich. He was in philosophy. She was considering medical studies. And they founded a student movement called the White Rose. And it was designed to call students to arms to say, this is not what Germany is about. This is not what our cultural heritage should have led us to. We need to protest this man. He is not standing up for that which is best about Germany. And she was trying to incite the students to protest, not to riot, but to protest. Well, a janitor, unfortunately, discovered a couple of the pamphlets that they had written, the two of them. It had fallen on the floor accidentally in one of the university offices. And he turned them in to the Gestapo. By the way, there were rewards for doing that. So it wasn't like this janitor just suddenly said, well, you know. No, there was money. There was money. So he turned them in. And so they were arrested on the 18th of February, executed only 4 days later, and they didn't do it by hanging. That was a typical German way of dealing with people, or by shooting them in front of a firing squad. That was a typical German way. They cut off their heads. And the last thing that both of them said together before they were killed was, "Let freedom ring." There's a movie about Sophie called The Final Days. It was made 17 years ago, and you can find that easily on Netflix, or by kind of looking at Hulu or looking at Tubi or whatever, and be able to call that movie up. It's very powerfully done. But again, two young people who also resisted Hitler. This is an emotional one for me as well, because this particular individual, Chiune Sugihara, was the ambassador to Lithuania. And when he got there, he realized that Jews were fleeing to Lithuania, and the capital at the time was a place called Kaunas, Kaunas. And he had to figure out, well, can I help these people anyway? And also he had a Jewish friend in the city, and that had an influence on him. He grew up as a Shintoist. That's the national religion of Japan. He was also from the samurai Bushido tradition, so he had that religious influence. But in his first marriage, not to Yukiko, but to his first wife, she happened to be Russian Orthodox. And so he converted to being a Russian Orthodox. That is, an Eastern Orthodox person in Russia. So the Russian Orthodox Church. So Christianity also had an impact on Chiune. And people would come to his office and say, we need to get out of here. If we stay, we die. And so what he did, he gave them documents that allowed them permission to go across Russia. They started out in Vladivostok, and that's clear on the eastern portion of the former Soviet Union. And they would get to Japan, and then from Japan they would go to various places around the world, some to the United States, some to Palestine, some to actually a Dutch island in the Caribbean called Curaçao, right? But he had to do these by hand. And he got so involved in this that he was spending 18 to 20 hours a day filling out these documents that allowed these Jews to escape. Now, I went to school in Japan. And let me tell you, those Japanese characters take a long time to write. And I remember in some interviews with his wife, Yukiko, that she would massage his writing hand. And even when he got orders to leave and go to another embassy, He was writing them on the way to the train. As he sat waiting for the train to depart from the station, he was writing more of these documents. And finally, as the train was pulling away, he throws the unsigned documents out the window and says, "Do with these what you can." And somebody shouts out from the crowd, "We will never forget you." Saved 6,000 Jews. 6,000 Jews. He goes back to Japan. It kind of has a bad next episode and then a better next episode. The Japanese government's not pleased that he's written all these documents. And remember, Japan was an ally of Germany, right? And so he's dismissed from his post. And he has to work a number of menial jobs, but then he eventually bounces back and runs, after the war, a foreign import company. And then eventually he is exonerated. But very few Japanese know what he did. So in the last 20 years, there's been a kind of Sugihara fetish, if you will, a kind of, you see those piranha when they come around an animal that's in the water, and they call it a feeding frenzy. There's been a kind of feeding frenzy on Sugihara, and an exoneration and an honoring of this person based on what he did. And when they asked him why he did it, he answered very much the way that other people have answered that we have discussed, and that is, he said, "These are human beings. What else could I do?" For him, it was kind of like, duh. They're human beings. What else could I do? So he actually risked and lost his career for what he did, but he saved 6,000 Jews. His wife, Yukiko, what to say about her? She wrote a wonderful book called, see if I can remember the name of it, translate from Japanese, Visas for Life. Visas for Life. Yukiko wrote about their particular experience. Okay, I gotta move quickly. Whoops, wrong way. Le Chambon-sur-Ligny. It's a Protestant village in Catholic France. So they know what it is to be persecuted, right? Because things were not always so great between Catholics and Protestants, and it wasn't so great in France. And so they were Huguenots, right? So as a result, they knew what it was to be discriminated against and oppressed. So what this little village did, they saved 5,000 Jews. I mean, think about it. A little community of 5,000 people saved 5,000 Jews. And largely influenced by the pastor of the Protestant church in Le Chambon-sur-Ligny, whose name is André Trocmé, and his wife Magda. Here's Magda, that's André, and their children. And so when they asked him the question, why are you doing this? And why are you, once again, God, letting me know, keep it moving, you only have 10 minutes. His answer was, yeah, I don't know what a Jew is. I only know human beings. Please remember that what Nazi Germany tried to do was to demote Jews to the status of being subhuman. Not human, but subhuman. The German word is Untermensch, which simply means subhuman, under people. So André and Magda Trocmé. Quickly toward the end now, I want to say something about some folks who eventually would be in the Soviet Union, in Belarus, in this forest called Naliboki. There were the Bielski brothers. The Bielski brothers. Maybe you've seen the movie from about 15 years ago, starring Daniel Craig, James Bond, James Bond, right? But he's in the film, and he plays Tuvia, and that it's also a good thing to look at as well. But what they did, they hid Jews in the forest. They hid Jews in the forest. And they also engaged in certain disruptive raids on the Germans in the area. They blew up bridges and they kind of destroyed railway lines. And they were pests to the Nazis in the Soviet Union, in Russia. Here's an actual picture of the group. That's Tuvia in the middle. And then that's Daniel Craig playing Tuvia in the film Defiance. So they save Jews through armed resistance. Okay, finally, I want to talk about an American that few people know about, and his story deserves to be communicated. His name is Varian Fry. He went to Harvard, not Princeton, but I'm willing to forgive him for that. He was eccentric. You got it okay, Brian? Yeah. He was eccentric. He had some weird characteristics. He was not blessed with social skills. But what he did, he was in Berlin. He was a journalist, and he saw people being beaten up in Berlin. And he just said, this isn't right. So the next year, he came back to the United States, and he raised money from religious organizations and from some Jewish religious organizations. And then he went to be a journalist in Marseille. He came within contact with some people who were great forgers, and they were able to develop documents that allowed Jewish persons in Marseille to be able to escape to Spain and to freedom. There's a wonderful film, I just watched it again 2 days ago preparing to be with you, and it's called Varian's War. Just Varian's War, W-A-R. Came out about 20 years ago. And the famous actor William Hurt, remember William Hurt? He plays Varian. And the beautiful Julia Ormond, not that I would have noticed, she's cute, but she plays her, his female co-conspirator, whose name is Miriam Davenport. So this guy, by doing what he did, by being able to forge documents and get French Jews out, he saves 2,000. He saves 2,000. So he's often called the American Schindler. The American Schindler. Now, this is the last slide I want to share with you, and then we can talk a little bit before we have to call a timeout. The Jewish Talmud, that is the rabbinic commentary on the Torah being the first 5 books of our Old Testament, the first 5 books of Hebrew Scripture. The rabbis commented on that, and that's called the Talmud. 13 volumes, they fill a whole shelf of one's library. It says, a person who saves one life saves a whole world. And I never forgot this little girl, Zenaida Guzman, who was a displaced person who, because someone adopted her, if you will, and got her out, she was able to live to a ripe old age. A person who saves one life saves the whole world. So, my friends, heroes of the whole. Ask some questions. What would you like me to elaborate? If you think I got some things incorrectly shared, then please correct me. I'm certainly not perfect. So what is it? Yeah, please, Lou.
Sorry, I didn't ask it at the time, but the picture of the brother-sister,
Yes, the Schrolls.
what uniform did he have on? Is that a Nazi uniform? He had on some type of, it looks like a military uniform.
No, that was not a Nazi uniform. I don't know what uniform that was. I do know this. I know that, and I'll say more about this on next Sunday. Hitler had it so orchestrated that everybody had to be, young person, a member of Hitler Youth. He displaced the Boy Scouts. He displaced the Girl Scouts, because those had presence in Germany. And he said, you have to be a member of the Hitler Youth. That was for boys. And what do you call women's group? The German Maidens. The German Maidens. So I think what that was is one of those uniforms that he would have to have worn as a member of the Hitler Youth.
But he was pretending to be a Nazi and doing his work, but that makes sense if he's a student.
Yeah, he's a student, he's young, and you got to be a member of the Hitler Youth. And it was kind of it became a paramilitary kind of organization, where eventually by the end of the war, Hitler was drawing from these young kids to go out on the front, and most of them were killed. but my recollection is that that's a Hitler Youth uniform. And it's kind of like being the librarian at Franklin University, where I taught in Indiana, was one of the nicest persons ever known. Vico von Strahlendorf was his name. And he grew up in Nazi Germany. And I could sometimes get him to talk about it, especially if I lubricated the conversation with some good German red wine. And he would talk about it a little bit. And he said, I was a member of the Hitler Youth. And inside I'm thinking, this is one of the nicest guys I know. This is Vico von Strahlendorf, who listens to classical music, and he writes poetry, and all the students love him. He goes out of his way to help people find things in the library, of which he was the head. And so I gently said, Vico, how did that happen? And he said, what was the thing to do? You had status if you were a member of the Hitler Youth. You had a uniform, Lou, if you were a member of the Hitler Youth. People looked up to you the way that people would look up to organizations for boys today. I know the Boy Scouts have fallen into some disrepair lately, the last 10 years, but he kind of said to me, it was kind of like being a member of the Boy Scouts, you know. You went out and you did hikes, and you did camping, and you did martial arts kinds of things. Then, of course, they had the same thing for girls. That they were teaching you domestic duties and trying to persuade you, get as married as young as you can, and have not one, not two, not three, not five, but 7 children. That was the goal. He believed that the Aryan race was superior and it needed fortified by more membership. And then that also fed his desire to annex adjacent countries, like when he annexed Austria in 1938, because he said, we need more living space. We need more room. We need more territory, because he was foreseeing an incredible multiplication of numbers within the Aryan race. P.S., and I'll say more about this on Sunday, Hitler doesn't look like an Aryan at all.
Yeah, what was he? Actually,
He was an Austrian,
but what was it?
self-proclaimed artist. He had spindly little legs. He had a caved-in chest. He doesn't look like the master race at all. He grew up Catholic. I'll say a lot more about this on Sunday. And had an incredibly close relationship to his mother, whose name is Carla. And as a result, that's going to cause him to reward women who have 7 children. That was the top goal. And you got a gold medal for that, if you had 7 children. I think you deserve even more if you had 7 children, but you got a gold medal, and it was named after his mother. It was the Carla.
Was she married?
His mother? Yes, his dad was not a nice guy. Again, I'll say more about this on Sunday. His dad was abusive, oppressive. He hated his dad. Hitler was physically abused by his father, and it drove him to be closer and closer and closer to his mom. And when she died of cancer, it was absolutely, absolutely devastating for Hitler. And his relationship with women through the years, I'll say more about this on Sunday, was not very good and healthy.
But since he didn't look Aryan,
Yeah.
what truly was his bloodline? Was he
Well,
nationality? I know the nationality, but what was he composed of?
He was Austrian. He was Austrian, and he made up this notion of the Aryan race. You know, the word Aryan is it's really a Hindu word. Talks about a group of people who came from outside of India and mixed with the Dravidians who lived within India to form what today would be the Indian people. So he borrows that. He borrows the swastika from them, because in Hinduism the swastika means well-being and good health and good fortune. So he borrows that. So his bloodlines are juxtaposed against this vision he has of the blonde, blue-eyed superhuman. And women to be blonde and blue-eyed and to be fertile baby producers. That was his notion, but he made that up. And just like he made up the notion of the Jewish race. Being Jewish is not a race. What are the three races that cultural anthropologists would identify on the face of the earth? What am I, racially? I'm a Caucasian, right? Right. What is my buddy Oscar? Black or Negroid, right? What's the third one? Oriental or Asian or Mongoloid. Those, not Mongoloid in the sense of being mentally challenged, but Mongoloid in the sense of being Asian. Those are the three races on the planet. And Jews come from all of them. You know, I've been in China and there are Chinese Jews, right? There are African Jews, right? There are certainly Caucasian Jews. That would be the majority. But Hitler invented this notion of, well, the Jews are a race, and they're a race that are not the Aryan race, because this is the Aryan race with these characteristics, and therefore we can do away with them. So it became a racial thing without truly being race. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's like saying, Schooly Woolly, that's your race, and so we're going to do away with you. And you say, wait, no, I'm Caucasian. No, you're Schooly Dooley, and we're going to get rid of you. That's what he did. That's what he did. Friends said, this is the best ice cream in the world. A lot of Germans would say that. You know, we're really the top dog. We're really the best of the best. Then the First World War hits, right? Then you got inflation. Then you got the reparations to be paid by the Treaty of Versailles. By the way, the Treaty of Versailles, yeah, today's the 18th. The 18th of January 1919, the Treaty of Versailles, the negotiations begin on this day, way back in 1919. So Germany has to make these reparations. Right? There's poor political leadership. There's chaos in the nation, and the timing and the situation are right for Hitler. You know, so many times it's a question of, is the situation right for a particular leader or for a particular event? And I think that, I said this this past Sunday, it wasn't that Hitler poured gasoline on the fire of the German house. Or, excuse me, I didn't say right. Hitler did not pour gasoline on the floor of the German house. That was already being poured. It was already soaking into the wood. What he did was, he had the match. And he lit it up. And the oratory abilities. I mean, I've listened to some of the speeches of Hitler, not because I thought they were wonderful. I was just curious how he was doing it. And he would practice for hours in front of the mirror to make sure he got all the gestures right. And he was a pretty doggone good speaker. He was emphatic. He made things very simple. We've got all of these things going on, but here's the answer. We need more living space. We need more Lebensraum. We need more living space. The Jews are responsible for putting us in this situation, so if we get rid of the Jews, we get rid of all these bad things. It was a very simple kind of answer, but people were looking for a way out of this. They wanted something that would make everything right. He wanted to return Germany to the greatness it had prior to the First World War. And he blamed the Jews for losing the First World War. He blamed the generals, who he thought made unwise decisions. He blamed the German people, whom he thought were influenced by Jews, to lose their zeal for continuing the war. I mean, he said all the quote-unquote right things. Right in the sense of motivating people to action. And he couldn't have pulled off what he pulled off without incredible cooperation and collaboration with the majority of German society, including the church. Including the church.
Why was America so reluctant to take in many Jews?
Oh, thank you for that question. Did you all hear that? That's a great question. Why was the United States, which, you know, with the Statue of Liberty, give us your, you know, why were we so reluctant to bring in Jews? Initially, I think it's because we were trying to remain neutral. You know, Hitler becomes the chancellor and president, that dual title, in 1934 following the death of Paul van Hindenburg, who was president. Hitler was made chancellor in January of 1933. So remember when the war started. It started in 1939. When did the United States enter? 41. December 7th of 1941. So there's a time period there. And when I was looking at that, the resources on Varian Fry, the American Schindler, he did his work before the United States ever entered the war. And he went to some of the key people in the State Department and said, here's what I want to do. I want to rescue Jews. I'm not Jewish, but I want to rescue Jews, and I need your help to do it. Give me a passport that will let me go to Marseille, France, which had fallen under Hitler's occupying forces. It was called Vichy, right? Vichy, France. Let me go there. They refused him a passport because he said, oh, we want to remain neutral. We don't think Hitler is great, but we want to remain neutral. Don't get us involved in things over there, like in the First World War. We got involved when? 1917, right? First World War was 1914 to 1918. We got involved in 1917, basically for 1 year. My dad, who gave birth to me when he was nearly 70, fought in the First World War. So he's not a Second World War veteran. He was a First World War veteran. He'd be like 140 years old if he were alive today. I mean, that guy. So don't get us involved. Don't get us entangled over there. And do you know how Varian Fry got his passport to go to Marseille, France? The State Department wasn't going to do it.
He forged.
Mrs. Roosevelt.
Oh.
Mrs. Roosevelt said, I'll sponsor you. And so she did. So Eleanor made that possible. Otherwise, those Jews that he rescued, those French Jews, would not have been rescued.
She was an independent woman.
She was. Thank God for that. Yeah. Please.
I've often wondered if some of the people who are going to fight the war going on now, if they're going remembering from the United States, remembering what happened in the Holocaust, or they're just people who like to get in war.
Now, when you say those people are
Well,
going,
like in Ukraine.
on the Ukraine.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Now, are you speaking about the
Like,
Russians that are ordered to go there, or?
People from the United States.
Oh.
We were talking about why we didn't get
I
involved.
think-
You know, now we have some people that are going over there.
Right.
So are they remembering what we didn't do during the Holocaust, or are they?
I don't know about their motivations.
Yeah, I wonder.
But here's my experience with what we sometimes call them mercenaries, and that's probably a negative term. But sometimes those persons go because they simply get a kick out of war and battle. Some persons go because it's economically advantageous. Some people go because they believe in the cause. And so I don't know the motivation for all of those persons, but typically you get those three motivators with persons who do that. Either they kind of glorify war, they want to participate in it, there's money to be made, or they feel some kind of moral kind of inclination to do that. And maybe in some cases it's a combination of two or more of those, so I can't really speak to that.
And they were, during the World War II, there were volunteers from the United States that fought before we entered the war.
Bingo.
I mean, so that's been happening.
And that's been going on forever.
Thank you for sharing that. One of my favorite groups is that group of pilots that formed the Flying Tigers. I just read a book on that with General Chenault and all those people. So people would jump in. They did that because they believed in the cause. They didn't do it for a bunch of money, and they didn't do it because they loved war. They did it because they thought it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, one of our doctors from Whitten Center that moved into Gateway at age 16 from Canada used to fly across to England to take planes at age 16.
Oh my goodness.
And my own father lied about his age. Not on my birth certificate. If he did that, they probably would have said, "Oh my God, you're older? You're older than nearly 70?" And I'm the oldest in the family, by the way. But my father lied about his age to make him older so he could enter the First World War, because he thought it was the right thing.
Wasn't there a movie that just came out about those pilots? that
Which,
went to
the
work?
Flying Tigers?
Yeah.
I don't know about that, or anything with the Tuskegee Airmen.
No,
No.
No, it was Emotion, Betsy, and it was the Korean.
no, this is a movie a while back that I saw.
Okay, so not the
About
Korean War,
about
but
the
not...
Americans going over and pilots and flying for the British.
Well, I know they did it in Asia with the Flying Tigers. They also did it with the Royal Air Force, the RAF. Some people
That must be the one
went
I saw.
across, and one of my professors in university was actually the pilot of the B-24 Liberator. He will never let me forget that. It's not a B-17, that was really a big airplane. I flew a B-24 Liberator, by God. And so he's a religion professor too, and he captained one of those planes from England. So there were people that went over and joined the RAF before we were ever involved in the war.
You know, we do have, excuse me, a veteran of World War II sitting here.
Ah, thank you for your service.
Well, you know, one of
Yeah,
our
I mean, really.
ministers,
That's why
one of our
we're
ministers, George Wilson, who was a navigator during the Korean War, his professor at seminary in Richmond would not give him above a D because he had done that.
He was penalized for that?
Penalized for being a navigator when they would fly planes over and bomb. No, it was Vietnam. It was
Oh, Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yeah. Talk about contentious wars. But there's another story too. If you've read Tuesdays with Maury,
Yeah.
that incredible book by a Jewish guy. Mitch Albom is Jewish, right? Maury Schwartz was also Jewish, right? Maury would not give the students in his classes at Brandeis anything lower than a B, because if they did that, then they were subject to the draft for Vietnam. So you kind of get the other side of that in terms of Maury Schwartz, because by that point people were saying maybe this war isn't such a good idea after all, and so he was not going to have people drafted from his classes because they got D's or F's, and so he didn't give them anything lower than
But you
a
don't go
B.
into one.
Jews stepped in then to become bankers because in the Middle Ages, Christians couldn't be bankers and loan money. Jews could. Well, then there was envy about that because they did pretty well. And so there's this kind of combination of jealousy, envy. They're not like us. Since they're not like us, they're inferior. Since they're inferior, they're a lower stratum of what it means to be a human. That has figured in Jewish history throughout time. So does that enter into some of it? Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. We're not immune as Americans from
And they
being
were Christ
anti-Semitic.
killers.
They were Christ killers. I'll say more about that tonight too. They did these terrible things. They crucified Jesus. Actually, they didn't. I mean, Jesus was not crucified without the complicity of the Sadducees, who were leaders of the temple, because they saw Jesus as a threat. But did the common Jews running throughout Israel at the time in the 1st century AD, were they responsible for the death of Jesus? No, the Romans were.
Well, they did scream at
Right?
that.
So these charges get layered on to Jews that just simply aren't fair. They aren't historically accurate. But I think if you asked people on the street, if you interviewed 100 people on the street of Greenwood or Greenville or Charlotte where Nancy lives, and you asked them, how do you feel about Jews? Are they responsible for the death of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ? People go, wow, they killed Jesus, right? Instead of looking at it historically and looking at it contextually. But part of the reason why Jews fall into some disrepair is that when Christians are struggling as a religion, we're a small group within the Jewish family. You gotta understand that. Christianity doesn't start as a religion, it starts as a sect within Judaism. It shares the same monotheism as the Jewish tradition. It shares the same scriptures. The New Testament doesn't come to be the way we see it today until 350 AD. So when Jesus alive? First third of the first century, right? So we don't have the Bible the way you and I would recognize it today until 350 AD. So Christians shared the same scriptures with Jews, right? We didn't worship in churches originally. We worshiped in synagogues. We didn't worship on Sunday. We worshiped on Saturdays. All of that changes by the end of the first century. And we're being accused by the Romans of being unpatriotic. We don't worship the gods of war. We don't. When have you made a sacrifice recently to Mars, the god of war? No, I don't think you've been doing that. At least if you have been, she needs to talk to you real fast, right? But Christians refuse to do that. We refuse to take oaths of loyalty to the emperor. We only took oaths of loyalty to God. So we were viewed to be unpatriotic. We were viewed to be radicals. We were viewed to be expendable by the Roman Empire. So now we come out and say, the Romans killed Jesus. Oh, whoops. We better say somebody else killed Jesus. So in that passage in the Gospels where it says, the blood of Jesus be on us and all our ancestors, that has to be interpreted contextually. That's a way of trying to say, don't upset the Romans. They already are killing us off. The Romans are. We blame the Jews. And my Jewish friends would say, ever since that time, Jews have been blamed for everything. And I tease some of my Jewish friends. My attorney is Jewish. And Bob and I have a kind of going back and forth. And he's my attorney in Indianapolis. And so when Indiana University loses to some other team, he'll send me a text and it says, we Jews messed up again. Because he knows that Jews get blamed. And they get blamed because of small numbers. They're different, right? And it fits in with a historical kind of demotion of Jews for no other fact than they are Jews. Well, we need to call a timeout. You've been very patient being here with me. I'll invite you, if your schedules permit, there are a lot more sessions to go through together. No session is a repeat of any other one. There's just so much information to share, and I've enjoyed sharing with you today what I was able to present. So thanks for being here.
I would venture almost everybody in this room has been to Europe and been to ghettos and places. Almost every one of us probably.
Well, then you know what the pattern is, right? If you want to get rid of people, how do you do it? Well, first, you got to identify them. So let's have them wear yellow stars. Hitler didn't invent that. He followed a long line of tradition, I'll say that this evening, of other countries identifying Jews. Okay, so you identify them, okay? Then you strip them of their rights, right? So they can't go to universities anymore. And certain professions that have given them economic clout and also some security, we eliminate that. Then we also say they have curfews, have to be at 8 o'clock every night. You can only go out and do your shopping from 3 to 5 in the afternoon. You can't hang out with Gentiles, and Gentiles can't hang out with Jews. Not even be friends, not even have dinner together, let alone date each other. If you dated a person who was Jewish, or a Jewish person dated someone who was not a Jew, instant death. You'd be shot on sight. Or alternately, you would have your head shaved, and you would have to walk around the city streets with a sign that says, I am a race mixer. Well, of course, you weren't a race mixer because it's Caucasian, Negroid, and Mongoloid, right? But that was the notion, that you're somehow allowing the superior race to be corrupted, and we need to return to a more pure, okay? Then you get these Jews together in one place, the ghettos. The ghettos. You concentrate them in one place. and then you get rid of them. And you ship them off to these different camps. Somebody said to me, how many camps were there? I lost count when I got over 200 or 300. It wasn't like, you think about, well, there's Treblinka, and there's Auschwitz, and there's Dachau, and there's Bergen-Belsen, and but those are just the ones that we regularly come to mind when we talk about it. There were hundreds of camps. And they organized that. One last thought, this will be a terrible thought, but thank God you stopped eating. Auschwitz had 4 crematoria. 4 crematoria. Each crematorium could burn up 2,000 Jews a day. So do the math. Even I can get that math right, and I'm not very skillful in math. That's 8,000 Jews being gassed and cremated every single day in one of the camps. So the effectiveness, the diabolical effectiveness and efficiency and the systemic kind of cooperation and collaboration was just really unparalleled. That's why, for me, the Holocaust is not the only Holocaust. And I'll talk more about that in the days and weeks to come as well. But to me, it was kind of the quintessence of evil, because it was so effective at doing what Hitler wanted done. So identify Jews, strip them of their rights, concentrate them, then send them off to camps and exterminate them.
How did these Holocaust deniers get away with it?
Yeah, that's amazing.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for the question, and thank you for the affirmation. One of my friends is Mike Vogel. He recently died. He was a Holocaust survivor in Indianapolis. And he has on his arm his number from Auschwitz. And he says, he would always do this. I had him speak on the campus sometimes. And he would roll up his sleeve and he would say, here's my number. Here's my number of an event that never happened.
Yeah.
And here it is. He would hold his hand up like that.
Yeah.
And then he would tell his story. So the most famous Holocaust denier is a guy named Earl Butz, B-U-T-Z, who teaches at Northwestern University, of all
course he
places. I'll be gentle how you say that. He could have been at Ohio State. He could have been. And he basically calls the Holocaust the greatest hoax of the 20th century. And I just keep thinking, how in the world can you say that? And at my university, one little last thought, and then we definitely don't have time out, because you're telling me, you're like my children. You know, my son does this, my daughter goes. At my university in Indiana, we had a Holocaust denier. And I confronted him, and he claimed academic freedom. That is, a scholar can investigate and reach whatever conclusions that scholar wants to reach, and there's nothing you can do to touch that person.
And he doesn't even have to investigate. He can just say.
Yeah, just say things. And so we argued that academic integrity and academic rigor were such that if you could not indicate that, then you had no right to put forth a premise that could not be demonstrated by any evidence. And his job was terminated. And he probably hates me to this day, but I think I did the right thing. It's kind of like the courts of Canada several years ago issued a ruling because they said hate speech is not constitutionally guaranteed. It's not, you're not able to do it without penalty. And that's a hard one for us, right? Freedom of speech, you can say what you're going to say, and blah, blah, blah. But they argued that words are the first thing that points toward tragedy. And so that you can't just say anything when it incites people to things or it causes things to lead to a diabolical end. And the quote from that opinion of the Canadian Supreme Court, I think I can quote it. He said, that's definitely God saying, let these people go. It's kind of like Moses, let these people go. Let my people go. The quote was, the Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers. The Holocaust began with words of hate.
But at
Think-
the
think
same
about
time, in today's culture though, hate speech has been redefined. It's not what it was when they were that. Anything
Say
can
just a
be-
little bit more so I know where you're coming
Anything can be defined
from.
as hate speech if they don't like it.
Oh,
You know, we need to get back to the real definition
yeah,
of
I
things.
think you're probably right. We need to get back to a definition of hate speech that says it's speech without evidence that condemns other people to untimely situations and ends. And that's the way the Canadian government defined it. So.
Excuse me, Dr. Cain.